So welcome everyone. My name is Nathalie Batraville, and it's my pleasure to be your MC tonight for the launch of Ted Rutland's new book, Displacing Blackness. I'm particularly honored to be part of this evening, given that Ted has been a wonderful friend, mentor, colleague, intellectual comrade over the past few years, and so it's really exciting for me to be part of this event and hear about his book. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. The island we call Montreal, called Tiohtià:ke, in the language of the Kanien'kehá:ka, has historically been a meeting place for many other indigenous nations, including the Algonquin people. The theft of indigenous land and sovereignty in the Americas was everywhere bound up with the theft of Black sovereignty, and everything that will be said tonight is meant to break with these twin thefts which continue to shape our present. Ted Rutland's new book, the full title being Displacing Blackness, Power, Planning, and Race in 20th-Century Halifax, develops a critique of modern urban planning that focuses not on its subservience to economic or political elites, but on its efforts to quote-unquote improve people's lives. These seemingly noble efforts, the book shows, have consistently relied on racist conceptions of what counts and does not count as a viable life. Focused on 20th century Halifax, Ted's research examines a series of important planning initiatives from a social housing project concerned with the moral and physical health of working class residents to a sustainability-focused regional plan. Along the way, the book shows how race, specifically blackness, has defined the boundaries of the human and guided urban planning throughout modernity with grave consequences for the city's Black residents. We have three speakers here tonight to discuss the book: Leslie Carvery, Ted Rutland himself, and Délice Mugabo. They'll each speak one after the other, after which time we'll have an open discussion where you'll be welcome to ask questions to any and all of them up here. After the discussion, we'll move back into the lounge area and onto the terrace. And that portion of the evening, the reception, will have a sonic landscape curated by Skin Tone. And so before I hand things over to Leslie, I'll just read quickly the bios of our participants. So Leslie Carvery was raised in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She has dedicated her life to the arts. Leaving behind her 20-year dance career in Halifax, Leslie moved to Montreal in 2013 for the purpose of writing and releasing the stories inside of her. She is the author of 3 books, including the novel Africville, My Home, and the graphic novel Big City and the Underground. Ted Rutland is a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment at Concordia University. His research examines the racial politics of urban planning, policing, and community organizing in Canadian cities. Délice Mugabo is a member of the Third Eye Collective, a Black feminist group that works with models of transformative justice to address gender violence within Black communities. As a geographer, Délice's previous research focused on anti-blackness in Montreal, and her current project explores Black women's political imagination in 18th and 19th century Quebec. Last but not least, Skin Tone is James Nicholas Dumille Godard's mostly solo performance project. Skin Tone explores issues related to Blackness, the canon, and the future. When he DJs, it's a blend of transnational folk musics, African-American classical musics, and other outbangers. Without further ado, I will pass over things to Leslie. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everybody. I want to start with a story about what happened 5 years ago when I left Halifax, Nova Scotia. I got on a train to come to Montreal for a different life. Just prior to that, I was walking through my neighborhood and I noticed some things that sometimes you wouldn't notice and sometimes you do. Like the man who just keeps walking around my neighborhood. I knew what he was doing. I knew he was going to buy up some of the property. He'd already bought the one to my left and now looking at my right. I knew I didn't have enough money to stay there much longer. So I made a very, very important decision in my life, and that was to actually pack up. Before this happened, a gentleman approached me, and he asked if he could do a documentary about my life. My dance studio, living in my studio, raising my son, and being part of the Black community. And I thought that was great. The documentary is called Pushed Out. And at the very end of the documentary, I was in fact pushed out of my neighborhood where I had been for 13 years teaching dance to a community that I hoped I could teach dance to the young Black kids in my community. But that meant that I wouldn't have the white people come to support me because they wouldn't come to my community to take dance. So it was this vicious circle that went on and on. And at the very end, I just got on a train 5 years ago today, and I moved to Montreal. I miss my dance life and I miss my community, but when I go back, I don't see anything that I recognize anymore. It's all been gentrified and changed. So that's the story of me. And but when I came to Montreal, I came here for a purpose of writing books. And I managed to write 3 of them while I was here, as mentioned. Have to Fill My Home is about my father's, I'll read from this, my father's story in a fictional sense. And then I Love My Life, so I thought I'd write 2 books about that. It's called Moments, Moments 2. And they're kind of like chicken soup for the soul. They're just a whole bunch of little stories about things that I thought were exciting, happy, thrilling. And it's sort of therapy for me, so. I actually have a book launch next Thursday at Shika Cafe. You can speak to me after if you're interested. But I'm going to read from Have to Fill My Home. I thought if I told that story long enough, my boyfriend would show up with my glasses. The summer of Africa was like no other place. A warm eastern breeze danced with the cool ocean. Smells of wild roses lingered with the swaying seaweed. The fragrance among clung to the blowing clothes as they tossed violently through the air. The dirt road was dusty and dry as the sound of crashing waves followed the gravel path through the quiet town. Rita Brown walked slowly up the main drag. It was a hot July morning. The heaviness of the toddler she clutched weighed by the physicality. Weighed on her. You're scaring me. Physically, as the thoughts bore on a heavier plight, she wanted to put him down, but couldn't. Holding him a little longer mattered. Dr. Stan Kelsey pulled his dirt-covered blue Chevy over on the side of the dirt road. He leaned over the passenger window. Frank Sinatra's voice was lowered in volume as the good doctor poked his head through the window. Rita, can I offer you a lift? Rita Brown kept her eyes downcast, looking at the dirty size 8s she had on her mother's slippers. They were a size too big and added to the discomfort of this walk. Dr. Kelsey waited as Rita made up her mind. Looking up the road, she could barely see 50 yards ahead, and she had a few more miles to go. Still silent, the doctor reached over and opened the passenger door. Where are you going, Rita? I said to pause. Her voice was soft. The child started to get agitated. Get in, the doctor said kindly. I have to get some pies from Pa's anyway. I'll take you. Rita lifted the little boy in first and then slowly climbed into the vehicle. Dust followed the doctor's truck as he drove slowly up the main road. Neighbors waved and addressed both Rita and the town's doctor. Pa Carver, shop and home, was at the end of the trail in Africville. He owned a small store run by him and his wife Liza. Pa was known as one of the more educated men in town. The house was one of the nicest. It was heard that he even had indoor plumbing, though this was not true. It was the house Pa had built from the ground up on his own. His land had been awarded to his father from the king. Pa made a living selling food products and hardware. His home was third from last at the end of the Africville Road. Dr. Kelsey, true to his word, had indeed entered the shop and back in his truck with 2 pies in hand. Rita and the child remained outside the doorstep. It was when the child began to cry that Liza came out. She held the wooden porch door. She held the wooden porch door as she addressed the young girl on the step. Rita, her voice was gentle. "What are you doing out here in this heat? You want to bring that baby in here? I got some juice, just made some rhubarb pie." Lisa's voice sang. Rita stood in her ground. She painfully clutched her son. She felt ill. Her legs started to tremble beneath her. "Come inside, child. You need to lighten your load." Liza held the door as Rita stepped into the house. The kitchen smelled of cooled sugar and berries. Sweat ran down Rita's neck. Placing the child down on the sunflower-printed linoleum floor at her feet, she watched Liza pour a cup of apple juice and hand it to him. The child quickly took the drink. "You want some pie?" Rita looked down at the boy. He played contentedly on the floor, juice staining his nice bleached shirt she chose for him that morning. Liza watched the teen girl with concern. "Is Pa home?" Rita asked abruptly. "He is. He's just upstairs." Liza looked to the staircase. Pa had been up late the night before, but Liza sensed Rita needed to see her husband. "I'll get him." Liza quickly moved to the stairwell. Rita had always liked Liza Carver, a school teacher. Rita herself had had her for 1 year. The kitchen was completely silent as Rita and the baby sat. The sound of Pa heavy on the staircase made the girl even more skittish. He was a large man. He entered the kitchen with a huge gust of wind. "Miss Rita," he greeted. Shaking, she jumped up to her feet. "Sir? What can I do for you?" Pa was a no-nonsense man. Rita feared him in his large frame standing over her. He was as big as his wife was tiny, and he was as dark as she was fair. They were the oldest couple, the oddest couple. Rita took a deep breath for courage. "Oh, my mama, I should come here and talk to you," she said. "You and the missus." Pa and Liza stood quietly waiting for Rita to find the next drop of courage. "This here is my boy, and he's 2, and I don't know much about caring for no baby, and Mama's, she's gonna help me, but she's ill now. And she says maybe, she thought that if you and Miss Liza, I heard you couldn't have babies." Rita's voice trailed as she looked down at the baby. He just stayed put, playing with the leg of her chair. "Who's the child's father?" Pa asked. Rita kept her eyes down as she mumbled, "Dennis Dixon, but he says no, and I ain't been with nobody else." Pa looked at Liza, and in silence they made a decision. "You want me to raise this boy for good, like my own?" This wasn't an unusual conversation in Africville. The town had its own way of dealing with adoptions and child keeping. It was more of a respected law. Rita nodded, afraid her voice would fail. "Well done." One word, a solid word. A word that sealed the most sensitive deals in negotiation. A man's promise and his solemn vow. Hot tears escaped Rita's eyes as she bent down and kissed the top of the baby's head. Before anything else could be said, Rita jumped up and ran out the door, her skinny legs jetting like a deer in the wild. Liza caught the door before it slammed. "Rita," she hollered after her. Several feet down the path, Rita stopped. "His name, you ain't told us that child's name." The faintest smile touched Rita's lips. "It's Nelson." She looked at Pa and Rita Carver, standing there. "Nelson Carver," she said. She whispered. With her oversized slippers and her skinny legs, 16-year-old Rita Brown took off running down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. It's really touching to see you all here. Thanks especially to Natalie, Délice, and Leslie for being up here with me tonight. Thanks to James for playing music later tonight. Thanks to Kathy for doing audio recording, Hélène for doing video recording. Thanks to Ashley, Alex, Claire, Tanya, and Layla for either serving up food or cooking food later tonight. And thanks to the amazing Librairie Racine for making the book available tonight for purchase. Thanks finally to just the many friends, colleagues, and comrades who I am happy to see here tonight. This book, like anything that requires a lot of work, comes out of a community of people who support that project and its author in various indirect and direct ways. And I owe a great part of this book to the communities that I'm lucky to be a part of in Montreal. So thank you so much. In what follows, I want to read a passage from the introduction of the book. Then I'm going to take some time to kind of unpack that passage and talk about some of the main aims of the book. And then I'll finish with a brief passage from the introduction. I should warn you that the passage from the introduction is quite dense, but it's meant to kind of lay out pretty succinctly the major aims and arguments of the book. And so everything that I say thereafter is going to be a way of kind of explaining and elaborating what I'm trying to say there. So you're warned. It'll be fine. Urban planning in Halifax is and has always been a world-altering instrument of power and race. As an East Coast settler city founded in 1749, its very existence is owed to the planned creation of a white settler city from scratch and the planned dispossession and murder of the native Mi'kmaq. This exercise of violent sovereign power, entwined with planning from the beginning, achieved its most gruesome effects in the 18th century, but it has endured into the still colonial present as well. In the second half of the 19th century, urban planning acquired a new form, as city leaders in the city began to introduce a set of techniques, forms of knowledge, and objectives that they described as modern. This newer, modern form of planning tended to be concerned less with securing physical territory than with producing and regulating material conditions in such a way that human life was protected and secured. Whereas Halifax's first planners sought to establish a territory that could be controlled and administered by the colonial state, an exemplary modern planning initiative would seek to protect the, quote, physical and moral health of city residents, make the city a, quote, more agreeable place to live in, or, quote, improve the general welfare of the population. The pursuit of such objectives from the late 19th century onward reworked and rearranged the ground of colonized territory. Significant planning initiatives in 20th century Halifax included the development of sewer and water systems, the establishment of building codes and property development regulations, the demolition of impoverished slums, and the redesign of the city's public spaces. And these and other interventions, the remaking of physical spaces through planning, was meant to act upon individuals and populations, to protect and improve people's lives according to period-specific conceptions of human flourishing. The arrival of these new planning ambitions was accompanied by new and complex forms of subjugation. As I explain in the book, modern planning's attention to human flourishing has gone hand in hand with various forms of physical displacement, political exclusion, sanctioned exposure to dangerous living conditions, imposed impediments to good health or welfare, and enforced restrictions on people's movements and daily activities. In some cases, effects like these are traceable to the exemption of certain lives from the sphere of planning's concerns. The terrain of life that planning seeks to safeguard simply does not extend to these lives. In other cases, adverse effects like these are more intimately connected to the operation of modern planning. Here, it is precisely through targeted degradation and subjugation that planning seeks to promote a better form of life, either for the broader population or for the adversely affected residents themselves. In all cases, the lines between lives improved and lives degraded is written most clearly and indelibly in the font of race. From the late 19th century to the present, evolving conceptions of race have shaped the meaning of the life that planning has sought to secure and nurture, and have contributed to planning outcomes that are racialized in both self-evident and surreptitious ways. While Halifax planners' horrific overt war against the Mi'kmaq has ceased, the city's black residents have experienced modern planning as an unyielding source of imperilment and plunder. These residents, who have numbered between 8,000 and 20,000 people in the 20th century, are largely descendants of formerly enslaved people who migrated to the region between 1783 and 1834 and were forced by the state to settle in a series of segregated communities outside white cities and towns like Halifax. This is a map of 7 or 8 black communities in the vicinity of Halifax. Modern urban planning, my book argues, is formed by particular entanglements with power and race. The power of modern planning is expressed less in the creation of sovereign territory than in the creation of material conditions that act upon individuals and populations, the creation through spatial means of tangible improvements in human health, happiness, and well-being. The paradox of modern planning is that these seemingly benevolent aims are structured by evolving normative conceptions of what it means to be a human being. Many social groups have thus found themselves expelled from the conception of human life that planning is sought to safeguard. Yet, life's pathological outside has been defined and populated most enduringly by the city's Black residents, and a deep-rooted structure of anti-Blackness has shaped planning's dealings with all city residents, Black and non-Black. This structure, this expression of racial power, is the focus of my book. The book traces the imbrication of planning, power, and race across more than a century of history in Halifax. Seeking to illuminate both constants and variations in planning's operation, each chapter documents the emergence and consequences of a particular planning vision or project, a particular instantiation of planning's more general commitment to improving life. The book, while attending diverse and not always racist forms of subjugation, advances the core argument that anti-Blackness is fundamental to the operation of modern planning. The moves of modern planning, its attempts to create a life-improving urban terrain, are rendered conceivable and achievable by the displacement of Blackness. This displacement is sometimes physical displacement, and sometimes symbolic, displacement from the field of planning's concerns. Displacing Blackness, physically and symbolically, is the unending work of modern planning. Did I lose anybody? So that's the introduction. So my task now is to kind of unpack that and connect it to some of the major aims of the book. Before I do that, I want to recognize the particular social conditions in which this event occurs. And so we are quite a long way from Halifax, but we're not at all outside the orbit of anti-Blackness and Black displacement. Montreal has its own history of anti-Blackness that dates back to the founding of the city itself, that moves through Marie-Joseph Angelique's burning of much of old Montreal in 1734, which is maybe the first major Black planning initiative, and continues into the present. Might as well call it what it is. And Concordia, for its part, sought to repress Black student resistance to racial discrimination in 1969, leading to the computer center occupation. And the administration has either ignored or contorted efforts to create a Black studies program at this university for almost 50 years now. In addition to this geographical context, I want to recognize the way that my own life as a Black scholar is situated within this field of power. And so my ability to write a book is derived from racial privileges that come in part from anti-Blackness, and it relies most importantly on centuries of work by Black intellectuals in the broadest sense that have made it possible for people to understand what anti-Blackness is. Some of these Black intellectuals, and I'm talking about anyone who thinks critically, had university positions and research grants, but many of them worked in incredibly challenging conditions, including plantations and prisons, and did not have the support in doing their work that I was able to rely on. And so this book relies on the courageous work of thousands and thousands of years of other people. The small contribution of the book is to connect this long intellectual history to the planning archive. And so ideally to put a little bit more evidence behind Black intellectual and political claims. And hope we can remember that as we proceed. And so one of the objectives of the book, as I sort of noted in the introduction, is to try to think about the specific links between planning and racism, and to locate racism at the core of modern planning. And this is something that doesn't actually happen very much in existing discussions of planning. The problem here isn't that no one recognizes that planning sometimes causes harm to communities of color. That would be really hard to not notice. The problem is kind of different. The problem is that when one tries to explain why communities of color are badly affected by planning, the explanation is usually that communities of color are more likely to be poor, and therefore more likely to lack the political power and resources to fight off harmful planning projects. This isn't entirely wrong, but what it does, it assumes that racism happens elsewhere, in the labor market, in the education system, and so on, and isn't shaping the way that planning operates. And so planning becomes this weird institution that is somehow immune from the effects of racism. It is shaped, if anything, by the effects of racism that occur elsewhere, like people being put in positions of poverty. So I think we need to think much more deeply about the way that planning operates within planning itself, and not only the way that planning is shaped by racism, the labor market, education system, police department, etc. My ability to pose these questions comes not just from paying attention to planning discussions, but these questions are also raised by a long history of Black intellectual and political work in Halifax, in Montreal, in the academy, and so on. I discussed the academic work that I rely on in depth in the book, but what I want to focus on here are a few of the really important Halifax-based Black intellectuals that have guided the work of this book. And so in Halifax, questions about the specificity of racism and its fundamental shaping of modern life are really elegantly posed by the African Nova Scotian filmmaker, historian, and poet Sylvia Hamilton. Hamilton, in a poem called Melville Island, has a phrase that says, "Home a stone prison, come in from the field one day to find out we've been up and sold. We invented temporary." And so in this passage, in which she's describing Black exchangeability, temporariness, and disposability under slavery, we can see the ways in which specific conception of Black life shapes what can be done to people, and shapes how the land can be inhabited and developed. And so I think if we draw on Sylvia Hamilton's poem here, as well as her broader work, we're asked to think more deeply about how planners conceive of people, how they conceive of Blackness, and how that shapes what planning can imagine doing and what it can't imagine doing. And so we need to connect these kinds of ideas, I think, to the history of planning. One of the ways that I try to connect these ideas to the core of modern planning is to look at the founding of modern planning itself. Now, modern planning where am I going? Modern planning in Halifax and across North America began with a few isolated planning interventions in the second half of the 1800s. It became a coherent program in the 1910s. Planning here involved a range of actors, including public health doctors, philanthropists, voluntary organizations, engineers, architects, lawyers, political economists, and elected officials. It also involved a series of concrete interventions in the spaces and lives of the city. Interventions that I would place in three categories. The first set of interventions were those that were concerned with public health, primarily the prevention of infectious diseases. Important interventions here included building codes and inspections, the installation of water mains and sewer systems, and land use zoning, the parceling of land into residential, commercial, and industrial uses. The second set of initiatives were concerned with what people called contentment, convenience, welfare, or simply well-being. These interventions included street and sidewalk paving, the installation of streetlights, the creation of fancy boulevards, and public parks. Third and finally, there were a set of interventions concerned with the efficient or economic use of land. These interventions included higher taxes on vacant or under-improved land use zoning, which zoning here is meant to protect property values, and the expropriation of properties judged to be achieving their less than best use. What unites these categories of intervention is their concern with the condition of human life, their intention to make life better. This shared concern eventually provided the basis for a coherent professional planning program centered on the multifaceted condition of life. As Halifax's first bona fide planner announced in 1915, quote, "The health of the people is planning's first care, convenience next, with economy considered all through." In practice, these concerns about the condition of human life had their limits, and these limits were most visible in the community of Africville. Africville was then a 300-person all-Black community at the northern edge of the city. Here, planning interventions that were meant to improve life elsewhere in the city were not implemented. A series of interventions were implemented, in contrast, that degraded conditions of life in Africville considerably. And in many cases, those degrading interventions in Africville were meant to improve life elsewhere in the city. And so health-impairing industrial facilities and medical facilities were moved from white neighborhoods to Africville in order to improve public health. And a 1915 plan sought to dispossess and redevelop the entirety of Africville land in order to improve the economic life of the entire city. None of this should be surprising when we recognize the way that human life was conceived in this period. It is seldom noted that modern planning was formed at the precise height of scientific racism in Canada, the rest of North America, and Western Europe. This is a form of racism that views people of color not simply as inferior, but as a degrading presence within the overall population, a presence that holds the country back. For modern planning then, creating a better form of life meant improving and sustaining white life, and only white life. Conceived in this way, the emergence of modern planning put the urban terrain in the service of white life and produced a series of improvements in white health, convenience, and prosperity, alongside and through the creation of Black dispossession, vulnerability, and death. Everything that happened in Africville helped to fulfill the racial mission of modern planning, the fostering of human life in its constricted racial conception. These contorted, disparate outcomes are indeed racially based. They follow from the racist conception of planning's object, its devotion to the improvement of white life. They also departed significantly from planning's treatment of a poor white community in an area called the Upper Streets. This area too was targeted for redevelopment just a few years before Africville. This plan involved the demolition of the Upper Streets area and the construction of a set of model tenements in their place. This plan also involved oppression, but it was oppression in the service of the better form of life that the tenements were meant to provide for their white residents. It was an intervention indeed meant to bring these poor white residents closer to bourgeois whiteness, and therefore widen the gap between white people as a group and all black people. This life-improving dimension of the Upper Streets plan was entirely absent in the Africville plan. This, then, is the difference between class and racial oppression in this period. It's the difference between benevolent oppression and just straight-up oppression. It's the difference between lives that are seen as pathological but improvable and lives that are written off entirely. This is one racial logic present at the very birth of modern planning that has never been uprooted and needs to be. The second aim of the book, as I suggested in the beginning, is to show how anti-blackness operates across the entirety of the urban terrain and urban experience. This aim, like the first one, is poorly addressed in existing discussions of planning. Existing discussions of planning, when they talk about race, usually talk about very specific spaces and lives, usually spaces occupied by people of color. Spaces inhabited and used by white people are usually ignored, as if racism doesn't operate there as well. When white spaces do come into the discussion, moreover, the observed effects of that racism are usually categorized in their sociological or economic terms, in terms of the property wealth that white people are able to accumulate, or the good schools that white people are able to send their schools to. But if planning is concerned with human life, then we would need to recognize its effects on the entirety of human existence, including the shape of our bodies, the nature of our feelings, the structure of our emotions, and our everyday experiences. And if conceptions of a human being in modernity have been anti-black, then we need to locate anti-blackness in the most intimate reaches of our life. The task then is to think about how planning is operating across the urban terrain and within and across the entirety of human existence. Here again, these kinds of issues don't just come from my analysis of planning discussions, but they come from a long black political and intellectual history. We can think here of the African Nova Scotian poet, essayist, and novelist, George Eliot Clarke. In an interview in 2001, George Eliot Clarke noted that Nova Scotia has this, quote, great beautiful landscape, but behind it or beneath it is this incredible history of sometimes great pain and tragedy. There is a need, this passage suggests, to connect the great beautiful landscape to its violent underside, to see the oppression lived by Black Nova Scotians as constitutive of the beauty experienced by others. Clarke, like many other Black intellectuals, urges us to identify the effects of anti-Blackness in non-Black lives and spaces, and to locate some of these effects in the intimate experiential reaches of life. One way to talk about the way that racism shapes our more intimate experiences of life is to look at the way that planning has sought to create experiences of urban enjoyment. And these objectives have been part of planning since the beginning, but they become more predominant in the 1960s. Today, they're most clearly associated with the work, if it can be called that, of Richard Florida and his creative class thesis. But as I want to show, we can locate the emergence of very similar ideas in the 1960s. And in doing so, I think we can learn something more about the way that Richard Florida's ideas have been taken up in the present and why they seem to resonate with certain populations. An interest in urban enjoyment emerged in the 1960s through the work of diverse actors, including heritage activists, neighborhood associations, economic planners, business associations, pro-heritage property developers, and new planning authorities. These interests led to a series of concrete interventions, including the establishment of heritage protections, the renovation of old buildings, the limits on new building heights, the gradation of pedestrian walkways, and the reining in of car-focused infrastructure development. One of the major actors that was trying to promote these kinds of urban enjoyment was a short-lived economic planning organization called the Nova Scotia Planning Secretariat. The Nova Scotia Secretariat was formed in 1968 and predicted that first world economies were transitioning towards knowledge-based industries, and that if cities wanted to succeed in the knowledge economy, they had to create enjoyable, lively urban spaces that would attract the footloose knowledge workers that cities depended on. This same point of view was taken up by an activist organization called MOVE, the largest and most broad-based activist coalition in the city's history. MOVE had its most high-profile campaign in 1972 when it opposed a planned expressway along the harbor side of the city. This campaign, which was eventually successful in stopping the expressway, helped to popularize an enjoyment-focused view of the city, the creation of enjoyment. Its primary argument was that the expressway would harm the experience of enjoyment in its most viable location, which was the downtown core. It argued in its campaign materials that the downtown was no longer conceived just as a place where people worked and then went home to the suburbs, but rather a place to live, work, and enjoy oneself on a 24-hour basis. The result, what was not recognized in MOVE's vision, unfortunately, were the very particular social limitations to the experience of the downtown. The downtown core, just a few years prior, had expelled 2,000 poor and working class white and black residents under an urban renewal project. At the same time, black activists frequently noted that racial discrimination among landlords and businesses reached its most intense form in the downtown core. And so clearly the downtown at this time was not a place to live, work, and enjoy oneself for a poor resident, and clearly not for a black resident. The way in which MOVE conceived of urban enjoyment as being obstructed just by a planning project has a series of important effects. One is that it ignores all these practices that are ongoing and shaping the way that people can use urban space. Secondly, it tends to obstruct any attention to things that might actually make that space more enjoyable for everyone, such as not just stopping an expressway project, but also tackling racial discrimination. At its worst, it actually defines urban enjoyment in a space where only white people are, and defines that as enjoyment itself. That creates all kinds of risks for non-white people are liable to enter in those spaces. And I argue in the book that this conception of enjoyment tied to whiteness might be one of the ways that the downtown of Halifax frequently erupts into quote-unquote race riots, which inevitably occur when a black person arrives in a place where they're not supposed to be. And so I think we need to think deeply about the way in which planning has conceived enjoyment, who gets to enjoy planning's enjoyment, to think about spaces that we find enjoyment, who's present in those spaces, and to think really clear, hard and long when planning appeals to our sense of enjoyment, says it's going to create enjoyable spaces, but doesn't explain specifically how existing barriers to the enjoyment of that space are going to be addressed. The last objective of the book is to try to think about how planning could be different. And here again, planning discussions are not as helpful as they could be. Planning discussions about how the city could be different often turn to activist movements that have fought for a better city and end up turning almost inevitably to the figure of Jane Jacobs, a really important activist in a lot of ways. Black-led urban movements, in contrast, are pushed to the side. In part, this is because they're put in a different category. They're treated as civil rights movements, black power movements, environmental justice movements, movements against police brutality, and so on, and not planning movements. But if we think about it for a moment, we'll realize that all these movements were concerned with urban planning in one way or another, and that all these movements contained a vision of how planning in the city could be different. And so I think there's a task then to think about black-led movements that may not name urban planning as their primary goal, but that nevertheless involve a challenge to urban planning, as well as a different vision of how the city could be organized. Here again, these questions don't come from an analysis of planning discussions, but come out of a consideration of the history of black struggle, especially in Nova Scotia. And so some of the most important black activists, I think, are Rocky Jones, pictured here, Carrie Best. We can also think about a long history of people fighting from the very moment that they're here, that they arrive in the city. And so we can think about people escaping slavery, people fighting their re-enslavement, people fighting for resources that they're not given, like water, schools, recreational facilities, people fighting against racial segregation, people fighting basically to achieve what other people get without a fight. The most powerful and I think instructive engagement with planning in Halifax occurred in the early life of an organization called the Black United Front, the subject of my book's 6th chapter. The front was created in 1968 amid the worldwide flourishing of Black resistance and a pair of high-profile visits to Halifax by well-known Black activists, including Stokely Carmichael, Miriam Makeba, Rosie Douglas, and 2 members of the Black Panther Party. During the second visit to Halifax by such activists, a 400-person Black family meeting was convened in the North End Library, and a new organization, dubbed the Black United Front, was formed. This organization brought together some of the most important Black activists of the period, including Rocky Jones and Carrie Best, and would develop a political program that was distinct from previous formations in 2 major ways. First, its membership and leadership would be entirely Black. Second, its major goal would be the achievement of Black self-determination. Self-determination was an important concept for many movements in this period. It meant essentially assuring that Black people could, quote, determine their own destiny, either through the transformation of existing institutions or the creation of new ones. The Front, though it endured until 1996, was most effective in the period between 1969 and 1974. Its major political concerns in this period were usually categorized as housing, education, and employment, but it also engaged with urban planning in at least 2 major ways. First, the Front challenged racist hiring and promotion decisions at City Hall. It documented and criticized the lack of municipal services and infrastructure in Black communities. It challenged racist federal and municipal housing policies. It directly combated racist landlords and employers, and called for the removal of white planning consultants from Black communities. Second, the Front created a series of alternative social programs. In the early years, the Front supported the creation of community-specific recreation committees that would oversee the creation of new infrastructure. It trained Black people to do housing surveys in their own communities. It oversaw the creation of community-managed housing and created new programs through which Black people could advance their political consciousness, analysis, and organizing abilities. In all of this work, the Front articulated and attended to a vision or genre of the human being that's very foreign to modern planning. The organization's varying commitment to Black life entailed another view of that life, a view in which Black particularities, when they existed, were not considered pathologies, and where a better form of life was possible and definable by Black people. Some of his actions aim simply to extend the benefits of planning to Black communities. Other actions, in contrast, devise new forms of planning based on the particularities of Black social life. Its housing program, for example, linked federal subsidies to community-supplied construction labor, something that Black communities had long relied on. The end result was thus a more efficient use of available subsidies, as well as an affirmation of Black mutual aid, something essential to the Black conception of what it meant to be a human being. These experiments in planning otherwise were ultimately short-lived, due to forms of state repression that I detail in the book. The example that it provides remains important nevertheless. For 5 years, the Front worked the outsides of planning's race-limited conceptions and imperatives, insisting that Black life was something other than a pathological version of white normality that, at best, could be rendered a little bit more normal, a little bit more white. This work, though eventually repressed and extinguished by the state, has endured nevertheless in smaller, less visible acts of Black resistance in Halifax area communities, and in collectively preserved memories of what planning can look like when Black people claim the ability to determine their own destinies. Deep-rooted links between planning, power, and race, the focus of my book, have shaped the lives and spaces of 20th century Halifax. Planning in this period took human life as its primary object and concern. Assessments of individuals and populations were its starting point. The improvement of prevailing human health, happiness, prosperity, and well-being were its priorities, and the remaking of particular or citywide living conditions was its method. Throughout the 20th century, however, Blackness marked the horizon or outside of the life that planning sought to sustain and nurture. Displacing Blackness, sometimes physically and always symbolically, brought the outlines of human life into relief, made it possible to discern prevailing degrees of normality and pathology among people, and helped to devise planning interventions that would produce more optimal forms of life through the improvement, containment, or elimination of the pathological. My remarks tonight, though focused on Halifax, are intended to have wider purchase. We are not in 2018 beyond the history that this book recounts, and we're not in Montreal beyond the geography that it focuses on. We can all then learn from groups like the Black United Front, as well as contemporary groups like Black Lives Matter that embody a similar politics of Black self-determination. These groups, whether we're talking about the United Front or BLM, have pursued a radical break with the forms of power investigated in my book. Whereas modern planning has incessantly displaced Blackness from the field of its concerns, these groups seek to move Blackness to the center. White normativity in this move is dissolved both as a standard against which people's lives are evaluated and the ideal condition that, through coercive interventions, people's lives might one day attain. And I'll finish here with a short passage from the conclusion. In practical terms, groups like Black United Front and Black Lives Matter call for political authorities to cede the human and physical terrain they have claimed. They seek to end the ongoing processes through which powerful institutions simultaneously assume jurisdiction over Black lives on the one hand and evict these lives from any desirable future on the other. For planning to heed these calls would mean moving immediately to redistribute existing authority and resources. This would involve, at a minimum, vesting decision-making authority in Black communities, diverting planning-related monies and technical expertise towards Black decision-making processes, and treating as illegitimate any municipal decision not made by Black people that significantly impact their lives. Actions like these, when they're demanded by Black activists, need to be supported by non-Black allies. What these groups teach more broadly is that a different future cannot arrive so long as white people cling to their own status quo. This status quo, this life that modern planning and state power have secured, is an obstruction to social transformation, even when its preservation is pursued within a social movement that also affirms non-white lives and interests. A different future requires white people to support and indeed prioritize other people's interests, but it also requires something more than that. It requires them, it requires me, to leave our place within the boundaries of humanity that has always depended for its coherence on the displacement and dehumanization of others. It requires us to refuse the ostensibly better life that planning and other institutions have offered us at enormous expense to others. The benefits of this life have never been and can never be universally distributed. They are predicated on exclusivity, violently defended. For white people to act against anti-blackness, as Christina Sharp suggests, is to leave the terrain of recognized humanity. Quote, "One must be willing to be more than uncomfortable," she writes. "One must be willing to be on the outside." On the outside, a place that Sharp notes, quote, "Some of us have never had any other choice but to inhabit," end quote, an entirely different and genuinely better form of life might be created. A new form of planning, one released from its centuries-old connection to race and power, will be created here or nowhere. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to speak at your book launch, Ted. It's a bit bizarre because Ted was first my friend and then he became my supervisor. So now I get to speak at his book launch. But it's also, Ted is also the person who introduced me to geography and who taught me to think geographically. And ever since, 2015 or 2014, it's always from you that I have come to pay attention to how geography very much impacts Black life, and also what really struck me in the book is how you pay attention to all kinds of documents and processes that are not thought of as having a geographic impact, but how I really got to read the book, learning how to do that, how to think beyond what a document tells us it's about, what a project tells us that it's about. So I very much thank you for that. And I also, and as a geography student, it's not, Black geography is still a field. I don't think it's any longer an emerging field. I think it's very well established, but we still have to not fight, but asserted as a geographic field. So the way you engage, and that's another thing that I've learned from you, to engage not only with geographers, but everybody does geography and take that seriously, and to read Black thinkers and read the work that Black activists produce as geographical thought. So yeah, I really thank you for that, and I say that as a student and as a future real geographer. Okay. Landlessness, containment, displacement, and out-of-placeness in Canada have all been recurring geographic themes among Black thinkers. So I begin with Norbese Philip, a lesbian Black feminist writer. In this piece titled Black Holes, so holes with a W and holes with a H, she recalls an encounter she had with a white man in downtown Toronto. And I quote, "You fucking people are all over the place." The white man's words remain with me for a long time. They reverberate within, all over the place, all over the place. If nothing else, it was clear that he felt I ought to not be on Sinclair Avenue West. The further implication of his statement was that my being on that street in Toronto was evidence that we, African people, I suppose, were all over the place. The corollary being that we ought not to be. For 500 years, the essence of being Black is that you can be transported anywhere, anytime, anyhow. For 500 years, a Black skin is a passport to a lifetime of slavery. I guarantee that the European can carry out terrorist acts against the African with impunity. For 500 years, the European moves the African all over the place at his behest and whim, and then one bright summer's morning, he looks me in the eye and tells me, "You fucking people are all over the place." Now, let's consider the words of Annick Germain, a white professor in urban sociology and immigration at the Institut National de Recherche Scientifique here in Montreal. In an interview with La Presse last year, speaking out of turn and over Black people, Germain praised Montreal in having succeeded where other large cities have failed. And I quote her, This is excellent news because this trend indicates much better integration by immigrants. Because it's a French-speaking society, Montreal has a greater cultural diversity compared to other Canadian cities. All these immigrants that choose Montreal really don't want to glue themselves to their compatriots. They left their country to move on to something else, to build a new life. They don't want to move into a neighborhood that will drag them back to their past. Now, I just noticed that I erased the first sentence. So the first sentence was about this report that she had brought out saying that Montreal was the first city where ethnic communities were now becoming more diverse, and that new immigrants were spread out in Montreal. And this was cause to celebrate because it speaks to there not be ghettoization. So I will come back to certain themes that Norbese Philip and Germain point us to, and where Ted's book takes us. But I wanted to start with Toronto and Montreal. While Halifax is the center of Displacing Blackness, my sense is that we should not misread it as a local history, but see it as one that's very much situated within the Black Atlantic. From its opening pages, it becomes clear that this is the story of how white power organized cities once slavery had been abolished, and Black women, men, and children had their own desires and demands upon the land they inhabited. A real tour de force of the book is in tracing how a number of white actors and their ideas about health, progress, morality, and governance traveled from England to Mexico to the United States, across Canada, and were applied in Halifax. In other words, a number of interventions in planning came from ideas that had been defined and applied in many other cities in the Western world. Tracing how and where these ideas were conceived helps us see how blackness anywhere has to be contained for white futurity to be expanded everywhere. This is indeed because slavery created a Western world where black people were all over the place. And the anti-black definition of modernity and progress in an era of urbanization casts blackness to the periphery and remakes black bodies again as movable. What Displacing Blackness keeps at the center is how projects of urban revitalization and renewal are built on the premise that new modes of living require black uprooting and dispersal. So this is why Annick Germain's statement was so violent to me, because it was a celebration of black dispersal. So first and foremost, this book is especially important for us here because of all the different ways that black community life in Montreal continues to be assaulted and the geographic consequences that this assault has on our various projects of black community building and organizing. Now, perhaps this is due to my own interest and approach to geography, but although this is a book centered on planning, I read it as a text of historical geography. Urban planning is interested in space, but I particularly appreciated how you paid attention to how history organizes people in space. What the book reflects is a mining of the archives about the process through which white power dispossesses black land and displaces black life. What you illustrate so well with the news articles, the legislation, the meeting minutes, municipal reports, and numerous other official and non-official records is how the black eviction from space is very much about rewriting the history of a place and simultaneously producing a white present and guaranteeing a white future. What we then have to reckon with is how planning is an activity built around making black people out of place, but also out of time. In reading this white archive against what you explained so well is how not only did white institutions not imagine a place for black life, but also no horizon in time when it could manifest. Displacing Blackness makes an important contribution to those of us who study the history of slavery in Canada and its afterlife. The book sheds new light on how Canada, and Halifax, Nova Scotia in this case, had to contend with the presence of both free and unfree black population. You explain really well how black people have been in Halifax since its founding in 1749 as property of white settlers. And then the black population grew from 1783 with three waves of new black population moving in. So, okay. Yes, so there were three waves of black freedom runners, and they arrived in a place that claimed to have land for free black women and men, but that had no intention to allow for black self-determination on that land. Here's where your intervention allows us to expand our study of the geographies of emancipation and black struggles for freedom. To be more specific, there's an emergent literature in slavery studies that examines how cities in Cuba and Brazil, and I'm thinking of the book by Camelia Coling and Aisha Finch, and then the book by Herman Bennett on Mexico, and then Graham Russell Hodges wrote a book about the US North. And last year, Armstrong Dunbar also published a book of the US North. They explain how cities were central spaces of Black struggles because this is where enslaved Black men and women in particular had the numbers, but also the networks and access to institutions through which they could organize collective resistance or individual pleas for freedom. So since rural areas were used as spaces of punishment and containment, moving to or fleeing to the city was a key strategy for achieving freedom. What you demonstrate in your text is that starting at least in 1850, so that's less than 20 years after slavery is abolished in British colonies, Black people had already been pushed out of Halifax. In painstaking detail, we learn how the project of industrializing Halifax relied on a surge of white immigrants, mainly Irish, combined with the relocation of the Black population to the peripheries of the city and in rural areas, and also in relocating Mi'kmaq communities outside the city. You explain really well, Ted, that urban planning ideas at that time were invested in improving living conditions as a way to make them morally and socially fit to live in this new urban setting, and that Black people were not considered able to improve at all or enough to be part of this newly envisioned urban society. I was wondering, though, if you could tell us more about the impact that abolition, and even prior to that, the impact that the presence of a large free Black population had on white urbanites in Halifax. I ask because after the publication of both of its slave fugitive acts, the American ones, Canada's response was a media campaign that put ads in American papers telling Black people not to bother coming because they wouldn't be able to survive or live well here. Slave owners in Quebec, in Ontario, and in the Maritimes at the end of the 18th century regularly complained that ever since they brought their slaves from the US, these Black men and women think and act as if they're free. So Black self-determination in the urban setting has been a problem for quite some time for white people. So to rephrase my question, did white people push Black people out of Halifax to punish them for having sought freedom and obtained freedom? And obviously, I say this knowing that not everything that Black people do is in reaction to white people, and constituting Black land remains such a crucial part of radical Black politics that I have no doubt that many, and maybe even most Black people, lived in rural areas and urban peripheries so that they could have more and better control over their own lives. So I understand that push for white Black people created so many communities that still exist today in rural Nova Scotia and outside of Halifax. But after abolition, did white people want to make Halifax the place where they wouldn't have to deal with Black people anymore? Now, how did urban planning of post-emancipation Halifax also reorganize the rural racial geography of that place? So I want to, and the reason why I just want to go back to a few steps before where you start in analyzing white people's imagination about where Black people belong in Halifax. I'm very, very curious about during slavery, what was their idea of Black people who were there, and how that push out of Halifax happened. So in conclusion, all this that I have said is because your analysis of Black organizing as a radical form of urban planning speaks to how Black people refused to be uprooted from urban space. So when you spoke about Black organizing in the 60s and 70s and even after that, Black organizing in Halifax, and then in Africville particularly, this was very much about Black people refusing to move, right? About claiming the city as their place as well. So this is indeed a Black claim to rural Nova Scotia as much as to urban Halifax, insisting on being all over the place. So and that's because Blackness is not nowhere but everywhere.
So at this point, we have time for a kind of more open discussion and for everyone to, I think Délice already posed some questions to Ted, but we could, maybe I'll take this off, so pass it around. So Délice already posed a few questions to Ted, but maybe we'll get a few more thoughts, not just for Ted, but for Délice and Leslie as well. And yeah, we'll have a larger conversation going, if that's okay with everyone. And questions, maybe? What do you think? Maybe it would be a good idea to stand.
Yeah. I feel like a talk show host or something. I think that, thanks to both of you, to Leslie and Délice for your words and thoughts. The questions you asked, Délice, are really thought-provoking, and like so many of the questions you ask, it'll be an answer that will maybe come later in little fits and starts. But I think that one thing that I've learned from Rashad Shabazz, an important Black geographer, and that I think I've learned from you as well, Délice, is that there's this constant dynamic within white supremacist societies between this force of displacing Black people and then this force of confining Black people. And that's evident everywhere. When we think of the prison system, it's obviously an institution of confinement, but it's also predicated on Black displacement. We're ripping people out of their communities and putting them in a prison. And then once they're in a prison, we're moving them from cell to cell and often from institution to institution. So there's this entwining of displacement and confinement. And then if we talk about planning, the book is called Displacing Blackness, but there are moments where it's all about containment. And public housing is a great example of that, where the logic of public housing, as Black activists in the 1960s in Halifax said, is they called them concentration camps. They're like trying to contain Black people and keep them out of the spaces that planning is now trying to redevelop. But then of course, so there's this displacement of people from where they are, confinement in public housing, and then of course public housing quickly comes under attack where they want to displace people again. Because we don't like the idea of too many Black people or too many low-income people in the same space. So all I can think is that, the white supremacist state and civil society don't really know what to do with Black people. We don't like it when people are spread everywhere. We don't like it when people are confined in one place either. And I think maybe there's a way in which that just creates this perpetual process of moving people, confining people, displacing people, without any real final goal of what's supposed to be achieved. But to answer your questions better would require thinking about these ideas, I think, through the archive and through existing work on a period of time that I didn't study for the book, which is the period right after abolition.
I have a question for Leslie. You told us at the beginning that you experienced that this displacement from gentrification, and in your story you talk about the sort of informal systems of adoption. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on how the displacement, this kind of destruction of communities, has an impact also on the way that people who had been adopted are then disconnected from the rest of the community if displacement happens and the people end up spread out all over the place.
Again, that would determine where you're from. In Africville, if you were displaced within Africville, you still knew who your family was, and it really didn't matter because the village was raising you, sort of concept. Bloodline didn't matter. I'm Carvery by name, but that story's about my father, so he was given to a Carvery. But all my relatives are still from Africville, so they're still from the same pool, so to speak. I just wanted to say something about what you were speaking to, and that's that the blacks never really did get into Halifax until they put them in Halifax. They went to surrounding places around Halifax. They weren't allowed in the main city per se. They weren't invited in. No one lived there. They lived in the black communities only. You had a picture up there of the places. So imagine there's the largest black indigenous communities are from Nova Scotia. So there's about 30 black communities in Nova Scotia all over. And most of them still remain. Africville being different because that was the one they tried and the one they got away with. The others were less important. And the idea is location, location, location. It was waterfront property. Okay, so it's waterfront property. It faces, we could put, before they even knew what a condo was, they had the idea that they could just move the blacks out of there. But it became such a sore spot, they were never able to put anything there. They put a container pier, which is making a heck of a lot of money, but then they put a dog park, and then, you know, it's a push and shove, and push and shove. We'll give you a church, we'll take back this, and we'll put your name back on it. We won't call it Seaview, we'll call it Africville again. So after you try to see that you've pushed them, and they push back and it doesn't work, the other places weren't important in the sense that they were up in the mountains or up over here, and they don't want that land yet until they do. My family, like I said, to current time, I grew up on Creighton Street in Halifax, and it was an all-black neighborhood at the time. My family, I think, are the only ones still there, holding down the fort. But you know, even as a single woman, I had a dance studio there, and I staked my claim and got pushed out fast and furious. So nothing that wasn't happening there isn't happening now. This is the exact same situation.
I just wanted to make a comment about what Délice had been saying. I had a flash of recognition when you mentioned how the Canadian government put ads after there was waves of people escaping slavery. I just had a flash of I worked in the Department of Immigration, and you had the Trudeau government sending members of black community to the United States to tell, for example, Haitians and different groups, don't come here. This isn't a good place for you. Your claims won't get processed. Those sorts of things.
Comments, questions? I have one. I was just wondering if you could talk more about, you mentioned the Black United Front, one of their main campaigns was around hiring in civic employment, was that right? Mm-hmm. Because I find that interesting. The other side is not just in terms of serving communities and how those communities are imagined, but also how services themselves become racialized in terms of who's providing them, right? And I think there's a long history in civic employment of it being explicitly racialized. I did research on Toronto, and it was dominated by the Orangemen for the longest time, right? It was like a white supremacist style of organizing employment. And did you do any research on that in Halifax?
Yeah, so I guess I'll stand up again.
It might be able to repeat the question.
Okay, so the question was about the Black United Front and their struggle over employment. And there's a whole bunch of ways in which they're trying to open up employment opportunities for Black Haligonians and Black Nova Scotians, using primarily the human rights legislation that existed for the first time around the time the Black United Front was created. And so challenging employers to actually hire Black people, which they were resistant to doing. There's a couple of really interesting ways in which the Black United Front did that. I mean, the first is there actually was, right before Black United Front was created, there was a guy named Carly Warner who was hired into the planning, it was an African Nova Scotian, who was hired into the planning department of the city. And he managed to get quite good qualifications, and he was passed over for promotion time and time again, and people with less experience and less education were getting the promotion. And so, you know, he called this racism. The Black United Front backed him. Hundreds of people descended on city council chambers, some quite, you know, doing a sit-in, some sort of throwing things, and really challenging these continually normalized promotion decisions. Another hiring decision is actually quite the opposite. The city offered the job of city manager, kind of the most important bureaucratic position at City Hall, to the city manager in Oklahoma City, who had spent the previous year just combating the Black majority garbage collectors union, and, you know, had been critiqued by civil rights leaders. And so the city of Halifax was just going to hire this guy out of the Deep South in the middle of all that turmoil and resistance, and bring him to Halifax to help a city that was enduring its own problems. And so Black United Front, Rocky Jones, who wasn't affiliated with Black United Front at that time, we're inviting civil rights leaders to come up and speak. The city maintained its job offer, but this guy decided to rescind it. He was just like, well, okay, this is not working. And then the last thing is that the Black United Front for a while had their headquarters in one of the largest, you know, post-Second World War kind of shopping centers, apartment complexes, and hotel complexes. And the owner of that property had no non-white employees. And so they, you know, did a lot of things about withholding rent, trying to force this huge employer to actually do what it should have been doing anyway. And so there are reports from that time. There's a lot more on that, but there's I think some really provocative and really effective ways that the United Front was fighting for that.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you very much. It looks very interesting. I enjoyed your historical perspective, and I would like to hear, if you want to expand a little bit, of what kind of forms of resistance you register in your work, and how can we learn the contemporary struggles against displacement, forced displacement, dispossession, and so on and so forth, that we can pick up from the history of resistance.
Well, maybe I'll say a few words, and then Leslie, do you want to say? Because I mean, your father and your uncle have been doing amazing work for decades. I mean, one of the things is just persistence. I mean, some of the more amazing victories that have come out of communities like Upper Hammonds Plains, Beachville, and Preston have been ones that people have fought for over a decade. Not usually huge protests, not usually heavily mediatized, but just committing to a struggle based on, I think, senses of community and solidarity that exist within those communities. And so this community called Upper Hammonds Plains, longstanding Black communities started to experience problems with their water supply. They didn't have piped in water. It was because of all the suburban sprawl that had started to happen around the community. And they asked the city to provide them running water. And the city refused to do that, even though the city's water came from a lake in Upper Hammonds Plains. And it was piped under the community into Halifax. So they fought for 10 years, and in a bunch of different ways, they finally got water supplied to them from their own community. But then the city tried to pass along the cost to the community of supplying water under the same project to a neighboring white community. And so they had to fight again to just not be overcharged for water. And so I don't, take from that history a whole bunch of interesting tactics that are really exciting to talk about. It's more like persistence, solidarity, community, a balance between kind of fighting dominant institutions and sort of mutual aid and self-help. But maybe Leslie has other things to draw out of it.
I don't know, when you're growing up in a house and your father's just constantly telling you, they took our land, and he becomes that just old angry man. You're like, yeah, Dad, okay, they took your land. And you don't realize the enormousness of it and what it really means. And as you're growing up, you really do. So every summer we spend, it's coming up in July, the Africville reunion, we get together. And it's about being with the people that you should have already have been around your whole life. But now people are dying out and our elders are leaving us. And my dad is 75 years old and he is fighting the fight. I mean, he is in the courts right now. They're waiting for him to die. He's waiting for the money. I don't know who's going to win. I'm rooting for my dad. But his cousin Eddie is the old hermit. There's books about Eddie. He's out there with his crazy hair and his dogs, and he's on the property and he won't leave. And then he has a heart attack and they take away his home and he finds it and brings it back. And he's and then they gave us the museum, which was a church, but it's actually a museum. So people come and they can look at it like it's, oh, this was wonderful. Look at all the beautiful Africville was. So it's an ongoing fight. It's I don't know if it's going to come to a head. Like I said, it's just this big waiting game. It's in the court system right now, and they never put Africville on the water line. They put everything disgusting and horrible on the land, a prison, a place where they chop up animals. They did all kinds of things. The city dump. They've been throwing garbage on us for years. I don't know if any of you have ever flown into Halifax, Nova Scotia. Has anyone been at the airport? It's the whitest place you've ever been. There is absolutely not one black person there. And if you come to Halifax, like I said, it's the largest black communities in all of Canada. You'd be hard pressed to find black people. You have to look for them. They're still up in their communities. More than 3 black guys can't go to a nightclub. There are no black nightclubs. They won't play more than 3 hip-hop songs together because they make get up and dance, and if it's all white people, that's okay. So there's just a lot of real deep-seated old racist things going on there. There's white supremacy actually growing. You know, we always thought it was going to die out, but it's growing. So the struggle's real and it's just ongoing. But beautiful place to see.
So in your presentation, you talked a little bit about the activist resistance to the Harbourfront motorway. I'm just curious, in your book, if you think about other forms of transportation like public transit as a form of racial containment.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was about whether public transport and other forms of infrastructure operate as a vector of racial containment. Yeah, and I mean, the last chapter of the book, I look at this sort of regional plan for the city, which was meant to be this way of like rationalizing the way that municipal expenditures get made and trying to create a more sustainable urban region, which is a great objective in lots of ways. But all of the decision-making processes that they put in place through this planning process, they were all these sort of technical decisions about efficiency, about ecology, etc. And they all just had the remarkable effect of harming black communities and benefiting everybody else. And so with public transport, for example, they want to use public transport money efficiently, which in the abstract is a great idea. But what they decide to do to ensure that that happens is to concentrate expenditures on new transportation lines in areas that are close to the city and relatively dense. But what that overlooks is the fact that black communities are generally quite peripheral and not that dense. Not because they chose that form of existence, but because that's where they were allowed to live. And so if you end up having an anti-black transportation logic that's totally justifiable in the abstract, but extremely harmful on the ground. And black communities have been fighting against that and demanding reasonable transportation public transportation to their communities. And does that function as a force of containment? For sure it does. It makes it extremely hard to come into the city to shop or get a job, for example. Basically have to have a car, because at some communities there's a bus that comes by once every 2 hours, and the last bus is at 6 o'clock at night. So you're extremely limited. And it's not like, even Preston, which is a huge community, doesn't have sort of like a downtown where you can get a job.
No, doesn't have anything.
I was going to ask, that's not a rural community, that's like a...
They become almost suburban now, because the city has sprawled so much.
Yeah, my question's for you, Ted. I'm wondering what, if any, resistance you have faced with the book, but also your work in general. And also if you could tell us a little bit about your process of writing this book, and from your position as a white person, and what it was like to engage in this work and to share this story, and just thinking about Christina Sharp's words of being more than uncomfortable and how you kind of navigated that.
Yeah, so the question is about resistance that I've encountered to this work, and the process of writing this book, doing this research as a white scholar. I mean, I suppose the resistance maybe might come more now that the book's out. The ways in which I've tried to talk about planning in Halifax haven't necessarily encountered resistance, but more silence. There's an African Nova Scotian leader named Sylvia Paris who was hired by the city to be kind of their head of African Nova Scotian affairs, and she saw me give a talk once on planning, and she invited me to talk to Halifax planners. So she arranged this talk where it actually happened over the phone, so I didn't actually see them. But apparently there's a room and there's 10 planners sitting there listening to me, both basically reading the last chapter of the book in which I'm critiquing the regional plan and all the harmful impacts it's had. And I was actually kind of nervous about the talk because I know this plan through the archives, and, and the amount of time that I spent trying to understand it is very little compared to the time that people are working on this plan day in and day out. I would hope that they'd understand planning better than me. So I was expecting a lot of pushback, and there wasn't any. And then I sort of asked at the end, after they'd asked me a couple of questions, whether they could point to a single planning initiative that had benefited Black communities. And there was just silence. They said there was one thing that they were hoping to do next year. And so it's not resistance, it's just like a wall of silence. And actually I felt worse after, because I was kind of hoping that someone would find some kind of contradiction in my argument. It was actually felt quite horrible to realize that things were just as bad as I thought they were. In terms of my process, I wish I had sort of, some wonderful kind of key lessons or something on how to do this work. But it has been uncomfortable the whole time, I think, which maybe it should be. It's also uncomfortable, I guess, because it's mostly archival work. So it's not like I hung out in communities and met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people while I was doing this. I mean, I mostly encountered people who are dead through the archives, and trying to think simultaneously about how to be accountable to Black communities in Halifax in the present, communities here, communities in geography, and a bunch of people who are long since dead. There's a bunch of, when all these sort of moral hygiene projects are happening in the early 1900s, there's a bunch of reformers who want to teach people how to live properly and how to maintain their homes and how to live upstanding moral lives. And they put out an exhibit on Gottingen Street for people to learn how to be like nice, normative white people. And in the archives of this organization that did this initiative, you hear that this woman come in aghast saying that she was out observing the exhibit that they had put up on the weekend, and a bunch of Black teenagers were throwing pieces of cardboard at her, and they knocked down the exhibit. And so actually, while thinking about how to be accountable to people in the present, I actually want to be accountable to those youth too, because I think they understand something. But it's hard because I can't meet them. It certainly helps to be connected to people here, living people who are doing similar work here in the broader discipline of geography, who are doing work. And then gradually, especially as I started to talk more about this work in Halifax, meeting amazing people in Black communities who have been struggling for a long time, and talking about what my analysis was and whether that resonated for them, and learning from them and trying to cite them in the work. That's about that's about the best I can sort of summarize the method of it.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a comment and a question. First, I just wanted to mention that somebody was asking about resistance in Halifax, and I just wanted to say that I have heard this really interesting interview on CKT just earlier this week about a big labor organizing movement of people who are maintenance workers in Halifax against racist practices in different maintenance companies. So if you're interested, you can check that out. I think the original interview was on Talking Radical Radio, but there's this big issue of many maintenance companies where they have like all the white janitors are working in the daytime and they get the good shifts, and then it's all the black janitors who are working in the overnight. So that's maybe something interesting for people.
And transit right now is going through
Pardon?
something. The transit system right now
Transit
is also,
system,
yeah.
And I had a question, which is like maybe a bit strange, but I was hoping that maybe somebody could answer this. I used to live in Halifax in the 90s, and it was pretty obvious the racism that was there once you scratched the like friendly surface. And one way it manifested was I noticed with a lot of white people kind of drawing these like imaginary boundaries around the city about where it's safe to go and where it's unsafe. And so when I was there, like the North End was this place that many white people would say, oh, I don't go there, it's too unsafe there. I remember at one point I had a friend who invited me to take part in a community garden near Uniacke Square. And white people were like, oh my God, I can't believe you would ever go there. And this is like, was not a dangerous place from my perspective of being in this garden. And then I went back to Halifax, so I lived there in the 90s, and then I went back last year to visit some friends, and I couldn't believe the change, like what you were saying. Like, it's amazing how it's all just like coffee shops and fancy ice cream places, and like there's just white people everywhere in that neighborhood now. And it made me wonder about that kind of like white geographic imagination and how it changes. Like, I've seen this in New Orleans as well, where there's this like period where it's like people don't want to go somewhere because it's too dangerous, and then at some point they feel that it's safe, the white people, and then they kind of go in and colonize and displace people. And this is my question is like, through your work with urban planning or just with having lived in the North End, like how does that process happen? Because I was kind of curious, is it like do the ice cream shops and the coffee shops come first, and then the white people feel comfortable to go there? Or is it more like, I know that in Uniacke Square there was, or not Uniacke, around the Commons there was like a lot of condo development. So is it more like a process of city zoning and condo development, and then there's like a greater group of people living there? Like, I was just curious how that kind of change in the white imagination of where it's safe to be, how that changes, and if you've had any thoughts about that.
It's both. It's both. Dee Dee's opens up a $7 scoop ice cream place, and then they come and they sit down and they sit outside and they eat it, and then they look around and it looks nice. And like I said, I saw the guy hovering around buying the property. So it's both. And it's also the planning from the within as well. When they told us that the Uniacke Square was going to be gone a long time ago. It's close enough now to downtown. It's the new Africville. And when property becomes someplace that looks better and your parking's going to be good and you're close enough to downtown, but there's a black community into that, what are we going to do? That's just what they do. And as far as what Shanice said, I wasn't sure if he was black or not. I didn't know whether to ask. And when you were talking, I thought you said you were black.
You did. I think it's a slip. You did, but it was a slip.
Oh,
So
shit.
nobody's.
Sorry, it's both, and it happened, still happening, and it's my whole neighborhood whitewashed is the word. It's completely gone. I used to be someone that everybody knew. Oh, the dance lady. I taught all the kids. They're all adults now, and I come home to visit. Like I said, my parents still own that house, and nobody knows me, and it's shocking. It's shocking to me when I walk down, and I'm like, well, who are you? They don't know who I am, and everybody in Halifax knows everybody. It's that kind of place.
Can I ask you, like, do you think it's like new people who haven't lived in Halifax Halifax before who moved there, or is it just people from other parts of Halifax?
That's a good question. I do see a lot of people who say they come from BC and they come from different places, and then they did do the shipyard thing where it was going to bring in everybody and give everybody a job and things like that. So I think it's some new people and then some adventurous types who just want to move in from out. So one thing that Ted does really well in the book is point to how urban planning is not just by professional urban planners, but also white citizenry. So how white citizenry are active in organizing black landlessness, basically, and arguing for it and developing a whole discourse around it. And there's this place where you say that anti-blackness opens up new source of institutional power. So he points to how regular people gained political power through anti-black political activity. So when we think of gentrification, is also like white citizens participating actively in black displacement, and that being political. So that's something that I really appreciated, and especially when so he speaks about the church, doctors, but also women who develop their political position as white feminists in their work in taking children away and things, advocating for cleaning or cleansing places of these places. So I think there's something to keep that in mind, that it's not always institution and power over there that does this work, but regular white people who actively do that. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, because often when we talk about coalitions and solidarity, as if regular white people are not invested in this.
One more question or comment?
Ted, can I ask you like a history nerd question? So do you see your work at all as intervening into like Atlantic Canadian historiography, which is like super white people still generally conceive of themselves in the Maritimes as an oppressed population? There's like debate about whether or not even the most important aspect of Africville is racism. Do you argue with those people at all? Is it?
So yeah, the question was how this book and my work relates to African or to Atlantic history. I think that's a hard one, because a lot of the people who have done this historical work on the Maritimes are quite old now, and we're doing work that I think they thought was really progressive and radical at the time, and I'm really a lot of the time calling into question what their conclusions, and so there are two quite talented historians in Halifax who write about this bourgeois women's association in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and seeing this as like women's empowerment, and it's exactly as Délice is saying. It's like empowerment of very privileged women at the expense of all working class women and poor women, and especially black working class and poor women. And so, I'm not really invested in trying to like critique the whole field. I guess I'm trying to, but it's there. So it sort of depends on whether they pick it up or not. I also have similar feelings about planning. Like, I'm not sure that planners will ever read this, and I don't know what to do about that. But I hope that
Send them the book.
Pardon?
Send them the book.
Yeah, send them. Well, then they have to read the thing. They can have the book, but. So I don't know. I imagine I'm sort of pitching my argument elsewhere while critiquing this work, and maybe maybe they'll read it and feel critiqued, or maybe some younger scholars will take the lead and try to do something different. It would be my hope, I guess.
All right, everyone. I would love to give a warm thanks to all three of our speakers this evening. They'll join me. So now is the time to drink and be merry and eat outside in the terrace and in the lounge. The book is also available for sale at a discounted price of $30, and you can get it signed by Ted if you would like. All you have to do is ask him. And so cheers, everyone.